Our Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this day and for this opportunity that we have to be here and to listen to Brian Stelter. We're grateful for the gospel in our lives and for the happiness that it brings us. We're grateful that we can learn from the examples of others at this university, and we pray that we can have open minds at this time, and that we can progress spiritually, and that we can become better each day. And these things we pray for in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.
Brian Stelter is a media reporter for the New York Times. He covers television and digital media and is a lead contributor to the Media Decoder blog. He joined the New York Times in 2007 as a business day reporter covering media. While a student, he launched the media industry blog CableNewser.com in 2004, which was renamed TV Newser and purchased by MediaBistro.com later that year. Stelter continued as editor through 2007. He received a BA in Mass Communications from Towson University in 2007, where he was editor for the Tower Light student newspaper for 2 years. I understand there will be copies of his book, Top of the Morning, that will be available thanks to the BYU bookstore. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy after today's talk, that will be available just outside the library auditorium in the foyer. Brian Stelter's presentation today, Social Media's Impact on Governments, Past, Present, and Future. Please join me in welcoming Brian Stelter.
Good afternoon, and I'll start by saying please live tweet this. Of course, please post as much as you'd like, get out the phones. I don't want to presume that all of you know what I even mean by tweet, so I wanted to start briefly by running through some definitions, defining our terms, talking about what we're talking about today, with basically what is social media. What do we mean when we say social media? Because it is a term that gets thrown around all the time for all sorts of things nowadays. What I mean when I say social media today, when I talk about its impact on governments, I'm talking about Facebook and Twitter and then all the rest. Really, that's the way I at least see the web. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, and then everything else. And everything else does matter as well. But of course, by far, the biggest, most important social network in the world is Facebook. There might be local rivals in Brazil and China and elsewhere, but Facebook is by far dominant in the English language. It's the one that most of us in the room are on. It's the one that most of our parents are on, if they're on any at all. And it'll remain that way for the foreseeable future. So it's really Facebook and then everything else. And then, of course, there's Twitter. To me, Twitter is the one I live on. Twitter is the one reporters tend to live on. Sometimes it feels like Twitter is a chat room for reporters. And unfortunately, nothing more than that sometimes. But it's got tens of millions of other users as well. It's no Facebook. It's not going to be Facebook anytime soon, but it is gigantic. And politicians and reporters tend to use it. Elites tend to use it of all stripes, whether that's celebrities or pundits and all of that. So Twitter ranks up there as being a crucial piece. And then everything else includes Foursquare and Instagram and Pinterest and Tumblr and LinkedIn. And these are all heavyweights in their own right for their own uses and for their own purposes. So I'll talk about them today as well, but focus on those top two because they have the biggest audiences and the biggest reach. But I would add two other mentions when I talk about social media. To me, email is the most basic and most fundamental social media there is. Whether it's an email listserv that you're getting messages from a campaign, or whether it's a link that you're sending to a friend, kind of word of mouth distribution via email. Email is a very intrinsically social media. Even though it's hard to track, it's hard to know how many people are sending links back and forth. It's a very important one, so I'd put that on the list. And then I'd be remiss if we didn't mention texting. Which I hope you all are doing right now, sending in tweets and Facebook messages, either through MMS, SMS texting, or through the apps. I mean, texting has really revolutionized, I would say, communication and media, and it is the ultimate social media. So that's what I'm talking about when I say social media today: Facebook, Twitter, all those other sites, and then also email and texting. Now, I use all of these, and I occasionally write about them from my perch at the New York Times. I wish I had a story up here today. I don't have a story in today's paper. I'd pull it up. But I'm a media reporter, and you can't cover the media without covering social media. I'll tell you briefly about how social media makes me a better reporter. I write about television, digital media. I occasionally write about journalism and how journalists interact with politicians and government officials. Everything from Al Jazeera to Bill O'Reilly to ABC and YouTube and Arrested Development. And I'm thinking I actually should write about BYU TV also, because I keep hearing about Granite Flats coming next year and how you guys are getting to scripted TV. It's the explosion in television to me is amazing. It's a great beat for me right now. And I'm able to cover it so much more energetically and thoroughly thanks to the web, thanks to social media. I benefited from a very 21st century fact, the fact that we can all be publishers. Let me pull up one of my sites real quick. The fact that we can all be publishers in a very real way is what powers social media. It means we can all participate in the news, and we can all participate in the world. And we, everybody in this room, for the most part, takes that for granted because we don't know anything different. I'm just turned 28, so I signed up for Facebook 9 years ago when it started, and I have had for my entire lifespan access to the web. When I was 10, I created my first web page. It was 1995, and I was obsessed with Goosebumps books. Did any of you read Goosebumps books when you were? Okay, good. I'm not. So I was a total Goosebumps dork in the 90s. I created I would say the best website about Goosebumps books, and eventually got to know the author R.L. Stine through it, which was kind of awesome. And it was an early wake-up call to me about how interactive the web can be. That a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old can meet the author of this book series he admires through the web. And then I grew out of Goosebumps books. I created a website about Nintendo games, and then I grew out of those, and I made one about Xbox games. And then in college, I created a website called TV Newser, which was and is just this obsessive daily digest about television news. Very insidery, very uninteresting to most people. But to television reporters, producers, editors, people who want to be those people, this is big, important news every day. What's canceled? What's up? What's down? Who's winning in the ratings? This silly scoreboard of who was most popular last night. All of this stuff became really valuable to people in the television industry. And so the Times hired me when I graduated in 2007. The New York Times hired me to keep blogging, to keep writing about television, and to broaden out. Now, 2007, that was a lifetime ago in social media and in the media in general. Twitter was just being invented. Facebook was still kind of new and mostly a college service. But since then, these tools, Facebook and Twitter, and to a lesser extent LinkedIn and others, have transformed the way I do my job and do my work. I market and promote my own work online. I use it to talk to readers, and it really helps me tremendously. It lets me know what's in the news every day, what people care about. It puts me in touch with my readers, my subscribers, my audience. It gives me ideas for stories. It gives me ideas for sources for those stories. It's basically a giant antenna that I can point in any direction I want to. If I want to hear what American Idol fans think of American Idol, I can point it in that direction through search and find out what they're thinking and feeling. If I want to know how people are reacting to what CNN or MSNBC did last night, I can point my antenna in that direction and hear what they're saying. And these sites also hold me accountable as a reporter. They hold me accountable as a writer because I can hear from readers who disagree with what I said or think I made a mistake or who think I was just dumb to write that story to begin with and should be focusing on something else instead. That kind of interaction, again, we take for granted because we've always had the internet as a part of our lives. But that's a really, really new and profound development. Writing a letter to the editor is so different from sending a tweet to the reporter and being able to hear back from that reporter right away. Now, all these same traits are true for politicians and policymakers and bureaucrats and prosecutors and, the elected dog catcher. The notion of more two-way communication between the public and the politicians or the regulators is something that is equally profound, I would argue. We've always had elections. We've always had that way to communicate our feelings, but now we can do it in a much more direct way, a much more personal way. And when I was talking about that antenna, that's true for government as well. They can use those same antennas. Of course, in some ways it might concern us, as we've heard recently about surveillance, pervasive surveillance programs, but also in ways that can empower the public. And that's what I wanted to focus on today. Social media's impacts on government, and I would say impacts plural, because there's many of them, are just beginning to be understood. But I'll try to bring a little insight into where we stand right now. I mean, it really is a first inning or second inning sort of situation, because these sites are new, Even email isn't that old if you think about it in terms of the span of our democracy. But it is something that's already clearly impactful. Sometimes the ways politicians use social media cracks me up. This was from last year. He still hasn't deleted it. His spelling mistakes here. Senator Grassley, whose tweets are usually actually rather entertaining for various reasons. Let's just see what he's done in the last couple days here. It's mostly sports, but to see a politician use great and the number 2 sign to abbreviate is kind of humorous, kind of creative, I would say too. But social is also really powerful as a megaphone in emergency situations. We can laugh at misspelled tweets, but then you see how governments, especially on the local level, use social media in emergency. You come away thinking it's actually not very funny. It's actually much more important. It was a wake-up call for me when I helped cover Hurricane Sandy last year along the East Coast. I'm a weather geek, so whenever I can go cover a hurricane, I raise my hand. And I noticed throughout the storm, before, during, and after, we were seeing the governments of these various states and municipalities use the web in really interesting, creative ways. I pulled up a couple examples here. This is a story I helped write that has a bunch of pictures and things like that of examples of governors and them using these sorts of communication tools. In this case, especially Twitter, because like I said, politicians seem to really love Twitter, and so do their agencies. But afterwards, we wrote a story about this, and I don't know if it might be a little too small to read, but I want to read this quote at the top of the screen. It says, "Twitter makes it possible for a public official to create a round-the-clock press conference, simultaneously informing their staff, the public, and the press." That's kind of interesting because historically, you'd hold a press conference, only reporters would be there. It would be them asking questions on behalf of the public. But now, more and more, social can mean that the public is directly asking the questions, going around the media, or complimenting the media. I'm not saying reporters are going away in this equation, but it allows the public to do more of the engagement themselves. I want to scroll down to one more line in here I found really interesting. It says, "Perhaps a sign of the times, but we found that many people do not own battery-powered radios anymore, and if they didn't have power, they couldn't listen to the governor's press conferences. Using their cell phones, Twitter was the last resource they had to them to find out what was happening when they were stuck in their homes with no power." And of course, we saw in Manhattan, where I live, where we were in the blackout area for 5 days, people huddling around the spots they found Wi-Fi so they could get on to Facebook and Twitter and read when Con Edison was saying the power might be back. And of course, they were able to yell at Con Edison via those platforms as well and complain. Increasingly, social media is also the raw material for reporters and for politicians to know what's going on, to know what's up, or to know what's wrong. Notice last month when there were these allegations of this major chemical weapons attack outside Damascus, Syria, most of the evidence first came from YouTube, and to a lesser extent from Twitter and Facebook and other social networking sites. But it was mostly YouTube videos that convinced the world of this attack. Now, of course, there are always concerns about forgeries and exaggerations on these sites. But you see enough of those videos, and you're able to corroborate enough of them the way that both reporters and policymakers do. And it adds up to a very compelling source of raw material for what then became threats about attacking the Syrian regime, and then became a diplomatic response. YouTube was foundational to all that led afterwards. Now, of course, a couple weeks ago, we heard Secretary of State Kerry hold a press conference, and a couple times he said, the social media, what we saw on the social media, and you kind of smack your head or you wince and you think, it's not, we know better. We know it's not called the internets, right? People our age probably wouldn't make those linguistic mistakes, but hey, at least he's paying attention. When you hear someone of his stature reference social media repeatedly, even if he sounds silly doing it, it's evidence of how impactful this media is. Of course, social can also amplify the messages of governments. I didn't watch Kerry's speech on television. I read the tweets about it. I saw the Facebook messages about it. That was my way of receiving what he said. And in that way, social can amplify these messages. And of course, that's not just true for the American government. Here is the official Syrian presidential Twitter account. Kind of unpopular. I mean, for a country, only 10,000 followers. And it's kind of funny that it's following 0 people. Not the most interactive in the world. if you take a look here, they're not really replying to tweets, are they? But they are on it. They see the value of broadcasting, at least, through these platforms. They are amplifying their own message, even if it may be inaccurate or downright offensive. They are using it to amplify their own messages. We noticed this again a couple days ago in Washington. Notice how it's sort of sad and striking how quickly the tone of the mayor of Washington changes. You start toward the bottom here. He's tweeting about his weekly radio address. Then the next thing he posts is an alert from the U.S. Navy about the shooting at the Naval Yard. And then the mayor says, please stay clear. Please stay clear. He's updating his constituents every few minutes here. He posted about 10 tweets in 45 minutes that morning, and then he's continued ever since. Updates on what's open, updates on what's closed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't just the mayor here. Notice that it's the D.C. Airport's Twitter account that's posting. It's the Navy Twitter account that acted like a breaking news wire when the first shots rang out. These government agencies, big and small, and these politicians of all stripes are aware of how important it is to be broadcasting in this way. And I think by doing this, they help relate to us. And by us responding, we help relate to them. Social can help us relate back and forth. And this is true, of course, when the White House posts a video of their new dog. Let's see if I can get it to play because it's adorable. That's the wrong video. This is how they announced that they had a new member of the family through a YouTube video and a bunch of announcements like that. This is a pretty powerful way to relate to your constituents. You might think it's ridiculous, and you might wish that the White House was only posting videos about public policy, but a lot of people, really engaged on this. Notice 2.1 million views, and of course tens of millions more on television after this was posted. What I loved the best was the slow motion shots. This was very slickly produced. But this is even more true on the local level, and not just about dogs. When a city councilman likes a comment of yours on Facebook, or when you see that person check into a political rally on Foursquare, you feel a much stronger connection to that person. At least the more web savvy among us feel a much stronger connection with that elected representative. Representative, I think, is the key, not to that yet, I think it's the key word here. Governments are supposed to represent us. So by being on the same social networks as us, by delivering information via social media, and hopefully most importantly by responding to us, by making it two-way, they can hopefully represent us more effectively in the future. And if they're not using these tools, they're missing a big part of their audience. I live in New York, so nearby me, Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark, is running for Senate in New Jersey. And let me pull up his Instagram page. He is famously such a socially media-savvy mayor. He's been doing an Instagram video interview series lately with questions like, if elected, will your Twitter habits change? And of course he says they won't. He says that he'll just keep on tweeting. It's pretty relatable. It's a pretty relatable thing to do, to be posting a video on Instagram. Because after all, most people that subscribe to him on here, and he's got about 30,000 followers, which, isn't a giant amount, but who knows, could make a difference in a close election. Most people who watch these videos probably don't watch much local TV. They're probably not in that demographic. But, of course, local TV is still a big way to reach the voters. But increasingly, the internet is too. And if they're not on services like Instagram, they're not reaching all of the people that they represent. They're only reaching part of them. And so these are ways how social media has already had a big impact on government. It certainly creates more visibility into what voters are thinking. It allows governments, big and small, far away and near, to hear our voices more clearly. Now, there is a risk that all of this is gimmicky. And frankly, when I saw this, Instagram video interview series, I thought, which isn't loading, which is probably a good thing because the camera was a little too close to his face. I thought to myself, it's pretty gimmicky. There's a risk that all of this can be a little gimmicky. It can look kind of silly. But it can also help. It can also help in times of emergencies. As I mentioned before, I want to go back to the story I wrote about Sandy, and toward the bottom here, and I'll just read this in case it's kind of small to see. When a woman who lives around the corner from Mr. Booker asked him on Twitter on Thursday, "Why don't we have our power back?" he replied that he didn't know. But he added that anyone in the neighborhood could come over to his house to warm up and charge their cell phones. And sure enough, a few hours later, the woman who had messaged him was at the house charging her phone and watching the movie Happy Feet. Now, I don't think every single person in Newark was going to be invited over to the house, it would have quickly gotten out of control. It would have been too crowded, no power, etc. But the notion that he was showing responsiveness, even if not to everybody, but to some of the people, is something that I hope and I think we're going to see more and more and more of. And sometimes, of course, these tools can have very serious consequences besides just charging your phone. Look at this, the New York Times story about Libya in 2011. The title kind of says it all. One Libyan battle is fought in social and in the news media. This was in the relatively early stages of the uprising in Libya 2 years ago. And it talks about how state-run television was presenting one side of the story, and opponents of the regime there were using Twitter and Facebook and satellite television to present their own side. And that there really was a battle that was playing out that way. And the last line of the story stood out to me. It says, whichever side wins this media battle will probably be well on the way to ruling the country. Social increasingly is a major battleground in countries around the world, including even in the United States. If I recall correctly, the first time I ever heard about Occupy Wall Street, nearly 2 years ago exactly today, was in a series of Facebook posts from one of the protesters who I was, second or third degree connected to. Then later it got onto television. Television was late to the story. Newspapers were late to the story. But they were able to tell their own stories online originally. And they were able to get the attention of governments and police forces, frankly, by telling their own stories online. We see around the world people using text messaging in particular to organize protests. It started happening over a decade ago, and it's happening more and more frequently now. That's not the kind of impacts the governments like to see from social media, but it's the kind of impacts we're going to see more and more of, because these networks are only becoming more expansive and more pervasive. It's remarkable to think that although the number of cell phones in the country is rapidly leapfrogging the number of people in the country, because some people have more than one, not everyone has a state-of-the-art phone. Not everyone is able to watch videos or send videos. As the networks improve and as the technology improves and more people can do those things, we'll see more and more organizing of protests. We'll see more and more people messaging their politicians complaining about lack of services. We'll see more and more of that. Of course, we sometimes see governments restricting access to social media. You probably have seen the stories this week about how Iran briefly turned on access to Twitter and Facebook and then turned it off right afterwards. There was a line toward the bottom of the story that made me chuckle. The judge warned on Sunday that Facebook is destroying families, saying that it is the cause of 1/5 of all divorces in the United States. Well, that's not true, but there are risks. There are risks to these social networking services. Social media can, of course, distribute propaganda awfully easily. And you can look no further than that Syrian presidency Twitter account for evidence of that. It can also distribute misinformation of all stripes too easily, and that can be a serious risk. Now, what I think, optimistically, is that yes, when misinformation spreads, the web also spreads the accurate information very, very quickly. We see that even this week in coverage of the Navy Yard shootings. It was mostly the mainstream media, networks like NBC and CBS, reporting wrong information. But then the truth got spread very quickly as well. And we noticed that as well, a funny moment during the coverage of Hurricane Sandy. But the New York Post reported at one point that the mayor was going to ban all cars in Manhattan. And then the mayor's press secretary wrote to the newspaper on Twitter and said, that's not true, that's not correct. So I think in some ways the web is self-healing. Yes, there can be misinformation, there can be misleading information, but I tend to think, optimistically, the web can be self-healing in that way. But there are other risks as well. There are dangers as well. One I am particularly aware of and concerned about is that we can narrow our view of the world by depending on our friends and not on strangers. We can narrow our view of the world based on what we follow and what we don't follow. If all of my friends have been to a restaurant, well, then I'm probably going to go to that restaurant too, if Foursquare tells me. If all of my friends I follow on Facebook are conservative, then am I going to see any liberal articles that pop up in my feed? This is sometimes called the filter bubble, and it's actively problematic for politicians as well. We don't want our politicians to only follow fellow representatives of the same political party. We would like for them to follow representatives from all parties and respond to citizens of all political stripes. So sometimes that's something that is increasingly problematic online. I personally, as a reporter, try to follow rich and poor, I try to follow East Coast, West Coast, in between. I try to follow Asia and Europe and all these different sources in different places because I want to hear as widely as possible what different kinds of people are saying and talking about and thinking about. We have to hope and we have to prod politicians and policymakers to do the same. But social at least does allow kinds of two-way interaction that couldn't happen before. Just could not happen. It's great to go to a town hall meeting. It's great to stand in line and ask a senator or a congressman a question. But now we can have many more personal and direct ways of doing so without having to travel, without having to hope we have a chance at the microphone. We have new ways, in other words, to hold our leaders accountable and to talk to government and for government to talk back to us. I find that's, again, especially important on the local level. There was a funny kind of combo of comments I saw earlier this week in my town, in New York. Someone had messaged the Department of Transportation in June and said, you know, where I live, if you just change this one stoplight, if you just change the frequency of the light, all the traffic on this street would fade away because there wouldn't be a queue, people waiting to turn. And this was posted in June, and I think they got some sort of lame reply from the Department of Transportation. We'll look into it. You know, it seemed like they were just shoving it aside. Well, this week, the guy replied again. He said, I just want you to know they fixed the light, and it's so much better now. Thank you. I love that the feedback loop was completed. The person complained, the government responded, did something about it actually, and the citizen followed up and informed people that it worked. Because we have to believe when we send these random messages, complaints or compliments to our policymakers, to our regulators, that they're actually listening, and that they, even if they don't change something, that they are paying attention to what we're saying. Sometimes reality isn't going to live up to this potential. Oftentimes, the reality is not going to live up to this potential. But we can prod our government to be more social. We can prod governments in other countries to open access and to not have to see headlines like Iran bars social media again after a day. And on the balance, I think these changes are good both for us as well as for government. There are dangers, there certainly are, but on balance, I view it as a good thing. So I'll pause there and get to the fun part, which is questions from the audience. I think we have a microphone set up over here on the side, and we'll ask you to queue up if you have a question or a comment about the social media's impact on governments or on journalism for that matter. So I think we have about 15 minutes. Does anybody want to start us off with a first question? That's right. That's right. Sure.
What's your name?
Okay. Oh, goodness. My name's Emily Jackson. I'm a poli-sci major. And my question is, you're talking about how the importance of having a really good spread on the information that you're getting, both, like seeing both sides of the story.
Right.
And I guess my question is, I feel like sometimes it's really time consuming and difficult for me personally to keep up with the news, especially seeing both sides, and I know the importance of that. So I guess my question would be, what would your suggestion be for us as students to stay the most up to date with news in the most effective way?
Yeah. I would say first, don't sweat it. If you feel like you're overwhelmed, you can't keep up with all of the Facebook messages you see online or all of the news articles that you see streaming through. The social web really is a stream, or maybe a river is the better analogy. It does feel like it's always coming. It feels like there's no end to it, and it feels like you can drown in it sometimes. And I frankly even feel that way. And I'm supposed to be the young Twitter savvy guy who's supposed to get it, with a bunch of followers and a bunch of accounts and stuff. I oftentimes now step back and take a break from reading all these messages because I know I'm not going to be able to read it all, and I know I'm not supposed to either. I think the best stuff surfaces to the top, even if you miss a day's worth of news or you miss an hour's worth of Twitter messages. I actually, when I was writing my book last year, handed over my Twitter account, my Facebook account to my girlfriend. She changed the password, so I couldn't get in. So I'd focus on writing, and it worked wonders. And you know what? I didn't miss that much. And I was a good wake up. It was a good eye-opening moment for me. That you can step away and it's okay. I kind of think of it this way. It's like a train that you're on, a really long train. And, when you're on the train, you can walk toward the back to the cafe car. You can walk toward the front for a better view. We're all getting to the same place. it's okay to slow down and take a break, to walk around in that way, to move back and forward like that. I think that the web does a good job of servicing the best stuff, even if we're not fully online. But listen, you gave me an opportunity to plug the New York Times. I think one of the beautiful things about the Times website is that if you log on it once a day, you're still going to see the most important things in the world. You're not just going to see what happened in the last hour. I love BuzzFeed and Huffington Post and sites like that for what happened in the last hour. But what I love the Times site for is that I know it's going to give me a recap of the day, especially if I go up to my personal favorite button at the top, today's paper, which just shows you what was in the paper today. It sounds old-fashioned, but the print edition is still a perfect summing up of the world. And so I end up on days like today when I'm traveling, coming to this homepage at the end of the day and just seeing, okay, what are the 5 things I should know? Yeah. Other questions? Do you mind coming over to the mic, and if we queue up a little bit, I won't take too long with my answers, I promise.
My name's Natalie. I'm a communications grad student. What are your thoughts about journalists using social media as primary sources, and whether that's acceptable or they should be looking more at backing up sources with social media? They shouldn't treat it as a primary source. Right.
I think I don't think there's any one right answer, but I find that for me and for my colleagues, social media should mostly be a complement. It shouldn't be a replacement for normal reporting, but it should be a complement because it can help us improve our work. I think it was Monday when the shooting happened at the Navy Yard, some of the initial factual information actually came from tweets from the Navy. And I remember in our early stories on the websites, we were citing and we were sourcing the Navy said on Twitter. If the account is verified and the account is known to be official, it's a perfectly legitimate source. It's no different than getting an email from a Navy spokesman or making a phone call to their media relations department. But we have to be careful not to get too dependent on any of these sources. I love to be able to add a quote from a reader or from a viewer of a television show who I find on Twitter in my stories. But if I were to only use Twitter to find viewers, I would be picking from a bad sample because Twitter users tend to be, more obsessed about television. They tend to be higher income. If you're very poor, you're probably not going to have internet access and thus not have access to Twitter. So Twitter is a self-selecting group, as is Facebook and LinkedIn and Tumblr, and we have to be careful not to over-rely on it. But there have been lots of times in my stories where I will post a initial story, say at 3 or 4 in the afternoon about something. And people will send me messages saying, you really should interview XYZ, or Joe or John, or you really should look at this study. And by the end of the day, when I've finished my story for the print edition, my story's better because I interviewed that person or I quoted that report. And in a very subtle but real way, it improves our work. So it's a great complement to all those other tools we have, like the phone and email and in-person interviews. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rex Wilkins. I'm something of a communications major, and I have a question about the filter bubble. You were talking a bit about that. Do you feel like there's a bit of a monopoly on that based upon a person's preferences on Facebook? Like if someone's very conservative, they'll see more of that, or if they're liberal, they'll see more of things from different liberal sources. What's your viewpoint on that?
That's exactly the risk that I think is there. And I don't see Facebook or other social services doing a good job of fixing it. For example, I think it'd be nice if Facebook, if I was seeing a bunch of liberal stories about Occupy Wall Street's anniversary this week, I'd love for Facebook to algorithmically find a couple of dissenting viewpoints from conservatives or libertarians and put those into my Facebook stream. I don't see them doing that right now, unfortunately. But that means we as consumers have to be sensitive to what bubble we might be in. For me, it means following a vast array of people, following Daily Caller's Twitter account as well as the Daily Kos's Twitter account and making sure I see both. For other people, I pull up this webpage. There's a book called The Filter Bubble, from which the term comes from. And he actually has the author put up 10 ways to pop your filter bubble, which I kind of find interesting. Some of these are a little, out of reach or extreme. You may not have to do all of these, but it's an interesting read at filterbubble, thefilterbubble.com, just to think about what data about you is being collected online? How is it influencing your Google results and your search results? And what can you do to avoid that from happening, at least somewhat? There's not a perfect solution or perfect answer right now. But it is a risk that I think we have to be sensitive about. And as media consumers, we have to make sure that we're looking for a diverse array of sources for that reason. The great thing, though, is that we are in, I really believe, a golden age of information. We've got more access to more sorts of information than ever before. It's only a click away. And we just have to prod ourselves sometimes to go and find it. Thank you.
My name is Kelsey Hershey. I'm a neuroscience major. And earlier we talked about some of the risks associated with social media. But you talked about risks associated with society almost as a whole. I'm more concerned about risks with individuals and social media that will later translate into social or societal problems as a whole. This is a fairly new thing, and I feel like people are just jumping the gun without really understanding the impacts it'll have on them as individuals and society in general. What's your opinion on that?
Tell me an example of the way it can be damaging.
For example, like an individual, because neurologically it's impossible to multitask. People are quicker at multitasking than others, but you can really only focus on one thing at a time. And so by advocating for people to almost like Twitter during their classes, in my one class we have Top Hat, and we're supposed to like do that at the same time.
You guys are ahead of me. I'm starting to feel like I'm old for the first time. I don't even know what Top Hat is.
But
I'll look it up after this.
My professors are advocating me to use these social media sites in classes. I almost feel like it's starting to consume everyone, and they're not able to focus on the material presented at hand, and they're becoming distracted instead of actually learning things and understanding them for themselves. So,
I think you're right to some degree about it, and I think what's interesting to me about the last year or so is I've seen for the first time a lot of essays and commentaries by technology evangelists who are starting to say the same things. Who are starting to say, maybe I should turn off my phone for the evening, or maybe I should at least set it to airplane mode. You know, maybe I should go on a vacation and not check my email all the time. And it's to me a very interesting counter trend against what is this main trend you're describing, which is this advocacy of it and this encouragement of it at all times. You know, I'm biased because, as I mentioned, my girlfriend taking my password earlier, I met her on Twitter, you know, so God bless Twitter for that. But now that we're in a stable relationship, you know, I'm giving her my password and telling her to take it away from me. I'm turning off my phone at bedtime so it's not vibrating all night, so I'm not looking at what's coming in overnight. I think as a society, and I hope we're learning those boundaries. And I'm glad that people are now talking about them in a way that like 2 years ago even, I don't think people were. But there probably isn't enough awareness of it among teenagers and among young people. There's more, I think, among our age group that's lived with it for almost 10 years now, and less among maybe teenagers who are just coming up against it. I'm kind of scared by the 13-year-olds I see using Instagram. And I think maybe that's where as a society we got to focus our attention is in these among younger people who are just figuring out how this stuff works or doesn't work. And sometimes the point is that it doesn't work for them, right?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think let's do a time check. I know we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes, so let's take a couple more questions.
Hi, my name's Rebecca Crandall, and I'm undecided. First off, a tip for you for your Facebook stuff. There's an app called Self-Control, and it blocks you from whatever website you desire for whatever time period you desire.
Writing it down, that's good.
Yep, it looks like a skeleton on like a spade. So
there we go.
It's fun. And my question is the lack of formality in media and personalization helping cause the back and forth and negative opinions? And for example, you typed in that video of the puppy.
Right, and then you got all the nasty comments. Yeah.
Yeah, the one that talked about
how can you hate
Satan
a puppy
and stuff. Well, they were calling Obama Satan. Right. And you know, you hear that a lot, and part of that is because they don't have a face and they don't have their name behind it really. So it's like that. But is that something that is a risk? And if so, what can we do about it?
the anonymity of the web is another example of a trend that I think is being responded to by a counter trend, which is this push among some websites, even including the Huffington Post, which is famous for its disgusting comments areas, toward requiring identities and not allowing anonymity. I think a lot of web publishers, if they could go back in time 15 years, would never have allowed anonymous comments for some of these very reasons, because they feel that it cheapens their websites. When I started TV Newser, it's up here on the right corner of the screen, it says send an anonymous tip. It was the best thing I did because it allowed people to send me complaints, compliments, ideas, tips, secret memos from networks, everything. It allowed them to dump stuff into that tip box. And it was really helpful for me, but it was also kind of gross. It's also, it caused me to grow very thick skin because of all the hate that would come in that way. And that's why I like on the web, increasingly we're seeing this counter trend toward requiring you to use your Facebook login with a real name and a real email address, for example. I think that's going to continue. In some ways, people are trying to undo the mistakes that were made 15 or so years ago. The other mistake, of course, is giving us all away for free, right? The Times website is now partially subscriber-based. Other newspaper websites are becoming subscriber-based, so you have to pay to access it. And as a result, I think the quality of the commentary will rise, because if you're paying for something, you're probably not going to scrawl nonsense all over it, right? Thank you. Well, maybe we'll have time for one more?
Can I ask a follow-up?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So what about from the congressmen and liberal and conservative medias, for example, Fox and MSNBC, and the viciousness that we see just in those? And there is no anonymity. They have their name tied to it, and they're getting paid to have their name tied to it.
That's true. That's true. Although I think I look at those increasingly as being on these edges and not in this middle ground where most of us are. Fox News and MSNBC draw big audiences at night. They are important to the political dialogue in the country, but they're also representing clear sides in prime time. They're clearly on the left and the right, respectively. I think most of us are still over here in the middle, and there's more media outlets that are hopefully responding to that middle. I mean, I don't think you can downplay or eliminate Fox or MSNBC in the same way you couldn't erase magazines for the left and right in the 70s or the 80s. But that means there's an opening in the middle for more reasoned debate. Look at CNN bringing about Crossfire. It's actually kind of a good show, Crossfire, because it's actually trying to get to a consensus at the end of the half an hour. It's kind of a good idea in an age of Fox and MSNBC. So my sense is that it's kind of a capitalist answer, which is that the media industry will give us solutions if we feel that that what's out there already is not to our liking, not to our appetite. Sure.
Okay. I'm Zach Bunch. I'm majoring in communications with an emphasis in journalism. One thing we were talking about the other day in class was how, as a society in general, we've kind of become more lenient with reporters and maybe more forgiving when they make mistakes because they're expected to get the news out so quickly. And one thing you mentioned earlier was that the web is self-healing. Right. They can it's okay to make these mistakes because they can tweet and fix those things. And so my question is, are reporters' expectations being lower? And 10 years from now, how do you think the quality of journalism is going to be affected by this push to get news out quickly? Do you think it's going to cause any decline in that?
I think this tweet from Monday said it really well. Stuff gets wrong more quickly. Stuff gets corrected more quickly, right? And that's how I kind of look at it. But I don't think that should be an excuse for getting it wrong. It would be bad if that's an excuse for getting it wrong. Every day as reporters, we have a chance to either help win back the audience that tends not to trust us or lose even more of them, right? We have a chance to either gain and regain credibility or to lose even more of it. And that's true for politicians as well. The credibility of Congress, the support for Congress is even lower than it is for the media. Every day, these sort of stakeholders have a chance to either start to win people back or to lose even more of them. And the more mistakes that are made, I still think it chips away at credibility. Even if people expect information to be wrong in the early hours, even if they see the updates, I still think it chips away at credibility. Every time you make a big mistake, you still lose 1% of the public's trust. Not 10 or 20 or 30, but 1%. And it adds up over time, I think, like plaque on your teeth. So although I think it's great that the web is self-healing, I think it is, it's still not an excuse to make those mistakes. And I think increasingly the web will help reward the outlets that get it right. I would love in the future to see a Google algorithm that knows which news sites make the most giant gaping mistakes and pushes them a little lower down the results and pushes the ones that get it right a little higher. Now that's hard to do, but we see, I think, a lot of startups moving in that direction, trying to get that right. And I hope that technology is a partial solution to those problems. Let's pause there. I'd be happy to take more questions one-on-one afterwards. I know there's some classes to get to, but thank you all for coming today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
If you're interested to buy a copy of his book, Top of the Morning, the bookstore is outside the room here. You can buy a copy and then come down to the front, and we'll just use the front here to ask questions or shake his hand or say hello. And don't forget, thanks for your tweets throughout. No one tweeted a question, but follow the conversation at hashtag BYU International. Thanks.